With the invention of the internet, it's far easier to find like-minded people who share your disdain for a certain TV show. It's all under public scrutiny as much as it's ever been, and usually when a show has a degree of hatred surrounding it, the reason for it can range quite drastically. However, sometimes it can feel a bit undeserved. And I can't think of any show that falls into this category more than the follow-up to one of the most well-respected animes of all time, Dragon Ball GT. Dragon Ball GT was a 64-episode continuation of the Dragon Ball franchise that ran from 1996 to 1997. Having grown up watching the original Toonami airings of Dragon Ball Z, I too was excited for the next installment of the franchise when it first came out. Unfortunately, my excitement soon wore off fairly quickly. I wasn't entirely sure what I disliked about it, but I ended up putting it aside for quite some time, and it wasn't until just a few weeks ago that I decided to give it another chance. To my surprise, I highly enjoyed it and found the hate I've had for it over the years to be misplaced. While having its fair share of problems, it's nowhere near as bad as people make it out to be. Yet what changed from then to now? What was it about GT back in early 2000 that was different to the viewing that I had in 2017? Back in the 90s and early 2000s, most anime shows localized for Western audiences kept their originally composed music, but there were some that decided to go a different route. Most notably, Funimation and their localization of Dragon Ball Z. Instead of using the tracks created by Shunsuke Kikuchi, the Funimation team instead hired the talented Bruce Faulkner to handle the show's main tunes. Most likely in an attempt to appeal to the demographic of young adolescent boys who, in their eyes, would most likely have found the original tracks to be silly or uncool. This decision over some time has become a somewhat heated debate amongst fans. In both cases, a trait of confirmation bias tends to rear its ugly head. Confirmation bias being the tendency to see new events or information and use them as a way to confirm an already existing belief. In this case, it basically boils down to which version one watched when they were growing up. If one were to be raised in Japan, caught the Japanese airings in the West, or began watching the series with Dragon Ball Kai, then said fan will have a preference to Kikuchi's tracks and those of the former Kai composer Kenji Yamamoto. If one grew up watching the original Toonami broadcast, which many Western fans did, then you'll most likely be partial to Faulkner's soundtrack instead. There are exceptions to this, of course, but it is the most likely scenario. However, one cannot deny that the localization still managed to make its own suitable tone for Western audiences. Dragon Ball Z was far more action-oriented than its predecessor, and while it's fun to make jokes about power levels, overly elongated battles, and ridiculous screaming matches, those jokes do not exist in a vacuum. Those are what people tend to remember because the show exhibited those aspects more and more as it went on. You can search YouTube for edited videos of the show's more important fights to see how ridiculous it truly got. Faulkner's synth and rock-infused tracks lent itself well to the type of action that Dragon Ball Z presented. DBZ, in comparison to the original Dragon Ball, was far more heavily influenced by science fiction than ever before, especially considering the first episode introduced a space-related origin for Goku compared to the Journey to the West-inspired background for the original series. As the show began to delve deeper into the sci-fi realm, the tone was ultimately set for Western audiences. Dragon Ball Z was a badass show about aliens, martial artists, and villains from all forms of life fighting in world-ending scenarios. Yet that wasn't the case if you were to watch Dragon Ball and immediately went into DBZ. Instead, you were to see a continuation of the lovable but naive Goku facing against foes of even greater magnitude than before, and the music reflected this. The tracks kept the same use of woodwind instruments, snare drums, and trumpets that were seen in Dragon Ball to keep a consistent tone across both series, keeping the idea of a natural progression of its show and characters instead of being a separate entity. Yet, while Funimation was able to nail their own created tone for DBZ, I don't believe they had the same success when it came to their localization of GT, and I believe this is what led to a large backlash against the show, whether one knew it or not. This is not to say that GT does not have legitimate problems, as it certainly does, especially from a storytelling perspective. However, music plays a much bigger role than one might think, and this is something that Every Frame a Painting tackled when he discussed the music of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. In said video, Tony makes the claim that the soundtracks of the MCU do not click emotionally with its audience, mainly because it's used as background noise instead of attempting to enhance the scene in which it's playing, or overshadowed by dialogue that does not need to be there. Oddly enough, the same principle can be applied to the soundtrack of Dragon Ball GT. What I want to focus on specifically is music implementation and how that affects the viewer emotionally. You can't just have a great original tune or a licensed track and use it without any thought. Imagine replacing the opening song of the 1986 Transformers film with one of its instrumental tracks. Whether or not it would improve or worsen the scene is to be debated, but it would completely change the tone of what it's attempting to convey. This is a trait seen throughout the entire run of Dragon Ball GT and Mark Menza's music. I want to make it clear, however, that I am not claiming his music to be bad in any way, shape, or form. While I'm not the biggest fan of it, it does have multiple tracks that I am fond of, and I believe he did a decent job. Yet I cannot in good faith call it a good soundtrack for this particular series. Dragon Ball GT was, in essence, a throwback to the style of adventuring that the series was first known for, evident by their decision to revert Goku to a young boy for the entirety of the series, meaning the tone of Dragon Ball Z with its elongated fights and ever-increasing power scaling was pushed aside for a more space adventure style theme. Which is where the consistent nature of the Japanese soundtracks came into play. While Kikuchi was replaced by Akihito Togunaga, the spirit of the music was still intact, maintaining the show's consistent musical feel while giving its own flavor that allowed GT to stand on its own. However, Funimation decided to go on a somewhat different route. As detailed by a 2012 interview, Mark Menza's GT soundtrack was influenced by his background as a jazz musician, clearly evident by the prominent use of bass guitars heard throughout multiple tracks. And again, while the tracks themselves can be catchy or interesting in their own right, it doesn't mesh with the theme of GT as well as it should. The idea of a space adventure is to be grandiose, motivational, and even slightly over the top, with dips of extreme lows alongside extreme highs. And you don't have to look far into the show's localization history to see these issues. I would be idiotic to talk about the show's soundtrack without mentioning one infamous track, the rap-inspired tune that's affectionately known as Step Into the Grand Tour. Step into the Grand Tour. Step into the Grand Tour. Dragon Ball GT. To say that reactions to the opening were bad is putting it lightly. While it has gotten some appreciation over the years in a somewhat ironic way, mentioning this track to fans is grounds enough for a full-on hate train discussion. Hold up with this. It's not difficult to understand why this intro was so viciously despised by the community at the time. As stated earlier, Dragon Ball Z already had an established tone, meaning when fans were ready to step into the Grand Tour, the last thing they expected was a rap-inspired tune, especially one that was not suggested by Mark Menza but by Funimation themselves. In that same 2012 interview, Mark Menza details the history of working on GT's production, and in regards to the opening, has some interesting comments on how Funimation tackled the project. Quote, "That was the first thing that I did on the show, before I saw any of the episodes obviously because they were still writing and figuring out sagas. They said, yeah, we want this thing. They really had this idea of this rap tune. I said, you know I haven't done a lot of that, that would be fun. I don't know how it's going to do with your show, but that's your problem." And in regards to the corporate direction of the project, Mark had this to say. Quote, "It wasn't like I said, hey, I have an idea. Why don't you have the opening of your new show that you're thinking about using me on be a rap tune? No, that's not how it works. I think it was trying to appeal to the fact that artists at the time like Eminem were so popular. That was my guess. Oh, you're trying to be hip, trying to be now, and get it out of the 80s rock guitar sound and make it sound more like that." Mark detailed what I believe is the core issue of Funimation's handling of GT at the time. Instead of attempting to look at the show from its perspective as a space adventure, they attempted to keep up with the times of what was cool back in the early 2000s. So instead of keeping the tone of what Dragon Ball Z had, Funimation decided to start over with a brand new tone that was only done for trending reasons rather than what was appropriate for the show. While it's difficult to judge if Bruce Faulkner would have been able to work with the show's more space adventure theme to a better extent, at least it would have kept the consistency of what was prevalent in the Japanese compositions, meaning the show would have felt like an extension of the franchise rather than a one-off side story. First impressions matter. Whether in social settings or in media, how you come across to someone is important. A show's opening, especially a new one, is vitally important to giving the audience a taste of what is to come. It allows the viewer to get excited about the rest of the narrative, and if the audience dislikes said opening, then why would they want to watch the rest of the show? Unless the show nailed every aspect regardless of the opening, then you've effectively casted an unwanted shadow over your production. Quote, "I didn't initially think it was going to be like super catchy. I have a hard time making really catchy tunes, but that's not what they wanted. They weren't looking for a catchy theme song, they wanted something that was edgier and different and didn't sound quite as predictable." That quote, in my mind, perfectly sums up the issues regarding GT's soundtrack and why I believe it did so poorly in its initial run. How many catchy themes do both Faulkner's and Kikuchi's compositions have? How important is the opening song Chala Head Chala to the landscape of the anime opening scene? Music is an integral part of the viewing experience. If the music does not work with what you are presenting, then you've essentially killed your show on the spot. The latest iteration of the franchise, Dragon Ball Super, suffers from many of the same plot problems that GT had, yet it is a far more enjoyable experience due in part to the energetic and exciting soundtrack used throughout. The tracks have a wide range of emotional themes ranging from the ominous nature of the Goku Black theme to the fighting game inspired tone of the Android 17 theme. This allows the show to have a dynamic range of melodies throughout its entire run that fit each moment and character effectively. By focusing on what the moment is about rather than fitting a certain trend, it allows the composer to bring what they feel is most needed for each scene. One of the differences between the two soundtracks is the way the music is handled. If I had to simplify it, it would be that the Japanese soundtrack puts more emphasis on making sure that a single moment is memorable, while the Western track tries to connect every scene together. The Japanese track is used sparingly throughout the entire show, making sure that the music creates a larger emotional connection with its audience. On the flip side, Menza's music attempts to flow from one scene to the other by having the music playing nearly at all times. As I replayed the scenes from both versions repeatedly, I came to the realization that they both have advantages and disadvantages, but one leaves a far more lasting impression. See, the Funimation score is most prominent when dealing with silence that they felt could potentially come off as awkward for Western audiences. In American television, there seems to be a habit of adding in music where there doesn't need to be, as a way to add drama or a tone that wasn't there before. One only needs to look at the differences in shows such as Kitchen Nightmares to get the idea.
Is that flounder?
It's definitely old.
Definitely old. It's green.
When are they from?
Saturday.
Saturday. Would you use them today?
No.
No, so what the fuck are they doing in the fridge?
The Funimation score does something similar, but luckily due to the music's low-key nature, it doesn't come off as annoying but rather questionably odd. However, this also works to the show's advantage. Whenever a minor comedic moment occurs or there's a period of slight tension, the low-key nature of the music gives the scene a bit of extra weight, something that the Japanese score can often lack due to having no music at all during those scenes. Yet when most think of Dragon Ball, they don't imagine the character banter or the moments of fleeting tension as often as the over-the-top battles, and this is where Funimation's score falls incredibly flat. The most notable example being the Goku vs. Legic fight that occurs in the same episode. Since his initial reveal in the previous episode, it's clearly foreshadowed that Legic will be Goku's biggest challenge in their current predicament. Therefore, the music during the scene must reflect the idea of an intense battle between two highly skilled opponents, as well as being the first prominent duel of the series, which adds even more reason to nail this moment down for new and returning viewers. As Pan and Trunks are taken out of commission, the Japanese music is once again used sparingly. It only comes in at two moments, when Legic makes his appearance and when the fight begins. In fact, when the two stare down for their battle, the high-pitched drone of the electric cage acts as a form of tension for the audience. Once the fight starts, the music subtly informs the viewer of what to feel throughout multiple stages. A sudden yet persistent drum and cymbal beat is heard to give the initial track's weight by opposing the previous silence. As Goku is forced into a defensive position and the fight is taken outside, the main melody kicks in and is used every time Goku is forced to defend himself. Signaling that this melody indicates danger to his life. This repetition is also heard in a quick tune that's played at two distinct moments. Each time this tune is heard, it's to showcase a surprise to the person on the receiving end. When Legic fires his attack, it's not known what it'll be, and after this tune is heard, it's revealed to the audience. When Goku uses the smoke of the missiles as a distraction, the tune is heard once again as Legic's eyes widen, giving him notice to where Goku will be, each time used to signify a warning to the character and the viewer that something unexpected is happening. It's at this point that a new melody is heard specifically for this moment where Goku dodges all of the attacks and the two fall into a struggle. As this is the one time where the two are on an even playing field, it makes sense to have this melody appear only once. which then switches to the melody heard when Goku is defending himself as he is launched through the nearby palace multiple times. As Legic sets up for a finishing blow, the music increases and climaxes as his spear is used to hit Goku away. When the two take a moment to acknowledge their strength and abilities, the music is kept away. It only reappears once Goku decides to take the fight seriously and transform into a Super Saiyan. And that's when the music kicks in. The music's tone gives a feeling of achievement and victory, telling the audience that Goku is now going to win the fight that he struggled with earlier. It gives a sense of relief and catharsis by having the track showcase the nature of where the fight is going to go, as well as building intensity as Goku charges his signature Kamehameha, giving the scene an extra sense of importance when the two energy blasts coincide and he emerges victorious. The Funimation score, unfortunately, doesn't convey such a tone. The trend of having music constantly playing in cases like this dilute the impact of many moments. Again, Legic's introduction was punctuated by the track that started once he appeared in the room.
What's this? You're still alive? Impossible!
In the Funimation scene, the music just does what it always does. Adds layers.
What's this? You're still alive? Impossible!
There's nothing that is really saying, this matters, when the music does the same thing in nearly every instance. Because of this, the fight itself doesn't stand out much either. The music feels confused. It'll build up the firing of the missiles, but when they land, it lowers in intensity when it should be rising. When Goku is holding the swords at bay, the music escalates higher and higher, but then when he's launched through the palace, it lowers itself yet again. Acting as if that was the finale, but it's not. And when Goku decides to transform, it's not treated any differently. The same instruments, barely any rise in intensity, and any lack of tension.
Massive energy build-up.
What?
The entire soundtrack is attempting to play this edgy power fantasy, but the funk groove style conflicts with that decision, as well as subtly telling the audience, don't worry, Goku has this, instead of, oh no, is Goku okay? This is why I decided to do an experiment. I gathered a few of my fellow YouTubers and asked them a series of questions regarding the Goku vs Legic fight and a few random scenes. Each scene was edited to have the Western localization soundtrack and the Japanese soundtrack playing over the English dub of the show, meaning the only difference between the two being the music itself. And to make sure it was as fair as possible, the Western localization was shown first, as it would have been if they followed the show back in the early 2000s. The questions were as followed. What do you feel emotionally when you watch the Western and Japanese scenes respectively? What differences did you notice between the soundtracks? Which soundtrack would you say fit most appropriately for each scene? And which would you recommend somebody watch if they've never seen this before?
The Western scene feels very standard. And in terms of specifically music, feels like it happens to just be playing in the background. Like I'm watching Dragon Ball and there's a stereo system somewhere that's just playing a song in the background in a room next to it. It doesn't feel like it's actively working together with the motion picture. Whereas in the Japanese version, the music seems very much made with the intent to enhance what's going on screen.
On a purely emotional level, the Western version was a blur in almost every sense. It was a total flatline. Even with the same visuals, however, the Japanese scenes were almost always dynamic, tense, and powerful.
The biggest thing to notice between the two soundtracks is their difference in tone. The Western version seems to be going for the cool factor, with its use of complicated beat or electric guitar. The Japanese soundtrack, however, seems to be more complicated than this, varying from situation to situation, and better mapping to the emotion on screen.
For the first scene, I thought the Western version sounded very edgy in the beginning. I don't think it did as good of a job as making me feel connected to Goku as the Japanese version did, because the Japanese version was more whimsical and upbeat and triumphant as Goku was winning the battle.
As for differences in the soundtracks, the Western versions featured music choices that would be confusing when analysed in a vacuum, let alone considered alongside the Japanese versions. The Japanese scenes featured unique and memorable melodies. The triumphant nature of Goku overcoming Weird Blue Lizard Man in the first scene is highlighted by that inverted pedal repeating that jaunty F major chord, which countered the tension of the previous silence, slowly but surely building to a climax as Goku unleashes the Kamebabibabiba before giving way to silence again as it's revealed that these two characters aren't actually enemies.
I feel that if I were to close my eyes with the American version, I'd have no idea what's going on. Whereas in the Japanese version, I feel like I can tell what's going on just based on what the music is informing me.
I think the Japanese version fits the scene a lot better than the Western version. The Western version sounds like some weird, disturbed, nu metal thing. The Japanese version made me think of classic Dragon Ball type music, and that's why I liked it more. So if I had to recommend a particular version for someone who hasn't seen this yet to watch, I would say go with the Japanese version. Well, for me, I get connected to the music in movies and shows and video games a lot more than the visuals sometimes, so I'd say that the Japanese version has way better music. It will probably do a better job at immersing anyone than the Western version. The Western version's very hardcore and like badass sounding and edgy and like early 2000s dude. It's very corny.
The Western version made me feel like I was watching a scene out of The Matrix, where I was pumped and excited to see how Goku dispatched his sparring partner. Compare that to the Japanese version where you have a fluty heroic theme playing that seems to better correlate to each stage of the fight. It's also worth noting that its lightheartedness makes a little more sense given the context. The Western version makes me want to see blood, not want to see them laugh. And it's these reasons that I would likely recommend the Japanese version above the Western version. While the power fantasy is fun and seems to be the goal of the Western version, I think there's some real substance to the Japanese version that the Western audiences are missing, even though everything else was right in front of them and unchanged.
The main thing is that the Japanese version really uses silence, and the Western version doesn't. The Western version seems afraid of the viewer being bored and going too long without hearing anything. The Japanese version isn't afraid. The Japanese really use silence and the sound effects occupying the entirety of what the viewer hears to either build tension or to have a sense of weight when the rest of the soundscape comes on, when you hear music, when you hear all of the sound effects, when you hear all the voices combined together to really make for a more emotionally engaging scene than you would otherwise if you were to just have music playing in the background constantly that the Western version does.
It always feels like the producers are terrified of a moment's silence, like the audience is immediately going to become bored if there's not some sound playing to distract them at all times. The Japanese version understands that almost more importantly than what music you use, it's all about when you do and crucially don't use it. You need those dynamics, you need the quiet to help define what is loud, so to speak.
I'd say that the Japanese version is the more appropriate one. There are some instances where I do feel like its silence is a little unnecessary, but for the most part, it's done with purpose.
Judging purely from these out of context scenes, I would be far more inclined to watch the Japanese version of the show. Besides its more memorable melodies and perhaps wider range of genres covered, I guess, it seems to trust its viewers a little more to endure silence because it's always in service of helping to convey a scene story.
Now, of course, having 4 people giving their opinions doesn't mean I'm right or that my viewpoint is correct in any way. My intention is not to say that the Japanese soundtrack is better or these people agree with me, therefore I'm right. Rather, it's to show how music can affect one's viewing experience in vastly different ways. If you enjoyed Funimation's soundtrack, then more power to you. Musical tastes are subjective, and I've read plenty of comments that stated it gave GT its own distinct tone that they enjoyed. However, my goal is to shine the light on GT's detractors as to why they may not have enjoyed the show. If individual scenes can have such wide varying tones, then what's to say that a person who hated GT's original run wouldn't enjoy listening to it with the Japanese soundtrack? Maybe even with the Japanese voices too. I'm living proof of that scenario, and I simply want people to have an open mind regarding this show if they haven't seen it in quite some time. You're allowed to find GT to be nothing more than glorified fanfiction. But perhaps now, with a slightly different perspective, it's one you can enjoy just a little more.